The 1918 flu pandemic, more commonly known as the Spanish influenza, was caused by the H1N1 influenza A virus. It is estimated that a third of the world's population, or 500 million people, were infected in 4 successive waves. It was projected that it killed between 50 to 100 million people across the whole world, making it the deadliest outbreak in history. The first documented case was in March 1918 in a United States military training base in Kansas. There were more cases recorded in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Since the pandemic broke out towards the end of the First World War, it is likely that it was spread through global shipping routes. During the end of World War I, most countries were censoring their news so they didn't get a bad reputation. The newspapers decided to call it the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country throughout the war, and they could easily give them a false impression, in which they succeeded. Surprisingly, the Spanish influenza had a very high mortality rates amongst young adults. Scientists offer several explanations why this is, and it is because it triggered a cytokine storm which ruptured the immune system of young adults, which led to many fatalities. Even though it wasn't as contagious as the previous influenza strains, factors such as overcrowded hospitals and poor hygiene made it even more deadly. The first wave of the pandemic officially started on March 4, 1918, after the case of Albert Gitchell at the Camp Fuston in Kansas. After he was diagnosed with the virus, 4 days later, 522 other men were infected, which already shows how contagious this disease was. At this time, the United States started to play a role in World War I, and the disease quickly spread amongst other military training bases. And in April 1918, it reached the Western Front. The first countries in Europe that the virus was spread to were France, Britain, Italy, and Spain. In the United States, there were 75,000 reported deaths in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Since the pandemic was still in its beginning stage, there were no reported quarantines. However, the first wave was a big disruption in military operations for every country. 3/4 of all French soldiers, half of British forces, and over 900,000 German soldiers were reported to be sick. The second wave of the pandemic started in August of 1918. Over the next 2 months, the virus was spread all throughout North America, then to Central and South America. It also reached Brazil and the Caribbean through ships. In Africa, it was spread along the coast, rivers, and railways. The second wave was a lot more deadly than the first. While the first wave resembled more flu-like symptoms, the people that were at high risk were mostly elderly people, while young people recovered a lot quicker. In the United States, 292,000 deaths were recorded between December of 1918. Also, in India, the pandemic was especially deadly, and they had 12.5 to 20 million fatalities in the last quarter of 1918. The third wave of 1919 started by the pandemic reaching Australia for the first time, where there were around 12,000 to 20,000 deaths, which followed a quarantine. The death rate for Australians was 2.7 per 1,000 people, which was the lowest recorded mortality rate compared to other countries. Throughout the world, there were hundreds of thousands of deaths, but it was less severe than the second wave, but it was still more deadly than the first. By 1920, the virus evolved into an ordinary seasonal flu, and by 1921, deaths had returned to pre-pandemic levels. Throughout each wave of the pandemic, the symptoms varied from person to person. In the first wave, there were normal flu-like symptoms such as a sore throat, headache, and fever. During the second wave, which was the most deadly wave, Bacterial infections were usually the cause of death. This generally caused the skin to develop mahogany spots on your face, then later your whole face would turn blue, which would later spread around your whole body. After this, death would happen within a few hours because you're dead, your lungs would be filled with fluids. At the time, there were no antiviral drugs to help fight off bacterial infections, so doctors used an assortment of medicines based on the symptoms of the person. Compared to the most recent pandemic, COVID-19, the Spanish influenza is not very well known, even though it is known as the mother of all pandemics.